It all began with a casual suggestion, a seemingly innocent idea thrown into the air like a joke among old friends. Lisa, who had been a friend for years, always had a way of lightening the mood. We were sitting around one afternoon at my house, lounging in the living room after a long week of life's usual grind, work, kids, and the stresses of daily responsibilities. It was just the four of us, Lisa, Sarah, Laura, and myself. There wasn't much else to do, so we started reminiscing about our childhood, laughing at old memories, and talking about our kids, who, much like us, had become the center of everything. After a few glasses of wine, the topic of genetics came up. We all had children, but we were always curious about what traits they had inherited from us and our partners. Some of us had kids who looked identical to their fathers, while others had children who resembled them more. It was a light-hearted conversation, until Lisa threw out an idea, one that we all laughed off at first. "Hey, why don't we take DNA tests for fun?" she said, a mischievous grin spreading across her face. "We can see what traits our kids got from us, and maybe some unexpected ones." The room erupted in laughter. At first, it seemed like the sort of thing that would make for a funny story later. There was no way any of us could take it seriously. Who would even think of doing something like that? DNA tests. It was a silly thought, but the more we talked about it, the more it seemed like a harmless little prank. It would give us something to laugh about. We all agreed, a bit giddy from the wine, and before we knew it, we had ordered the test kits. It felt like an innocent way to pass the time. What could possibly go wrong? We didn't even consider the possibility of uncovering something far darker than we had imagined. The whole situation was absurd to us, and yet, we were so caught up in the novelty of it all that we didn't see the warning signs. A week later, the DNA kits arrived, and we were excited to see the results. We gathered at my house again, this time with an air of playful anticipation. We opened the results one by one, sharing little laughs and teasing each other about the results, how much the kids resembled one parent or the other, and whether we had anything surprising in common genetically. We joked about potential family secrets, but none of us could have prepared for what came next. As I opened the first envelope, I glanced at the results. It looked like a typical DNA report, percentages of genetic similarities, breakdowns of heritage, and so on. I had expected nothing out of the ordinary. But then, as I read further down the page, something strange caught my eye. I paused. There, written in clear, bold letters, was a detail that made my stomach drop. The father listed for my child was not the man I had married. It wasn't even a name I recognized. My heart raced as I tried to comprehend what I was seeing. I thought it was a mistake. Maybe a typo, maybe a mix-up in the lab. But I couldn't ignore the feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right, guys? I called out to the others, my voice shaking slightly. This is weird. This isn't my husband's name. It says, someone else. The others laughed, thinking I was joking. But my voice was trembling with fear. Sarah was the next to open her envelope, and it didn't take long before her face drained of color. She looked up, her hands trembling as she held the paper. No, this can't be right. We all shared a glance of confusion and horror as each of us slowly revealed the same shocking discovery. Every one of us had a different name listed as the biological father of our children. All our kids, all 5 of them, had the same man listed. It was impossible. We had all been so sure about who the fathers were. We had lived our lives believing in our partners, in our families, and in the relationships we thought were built on trust. But now, we were holding a piece of paper that shattered that trust. The man listed as the father of our children wasn't any of our husbands. It was him, the one person none of us had ever suspected, our family doctor. Dr. William Hayes. He had been our trusted fertility specialist, the one we turned to for guidance when it came to conceiving. He had been our confidant, our source of hope during our darkest moments. But now, his name sat there on the page in front of us, glaring back at us like a cruel joke that I could barely breathe as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The man we had trusted with our deepest secrets, the man who had helped us bring new life into this world, had used his position to manipulate us. He had used his sperm, without our consent, to father all our children. He had violated every boundary we thought we could trust that I couldn't wrap my head around it. I kept reading and rereading the results, trying to make sense of it. But the truth was undeniable. This wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't an accident. Dr. Hayes had taken advantage of his position and had created life, not by accident, but with purpose. The silence in the room was suffocating. We all sat there, stunned, unable to process what we had just discovered. Our laughter from earlier had evaporated, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. How could he have done this to us? How could he have betrayed our trust so completely? It was the betrayal of a lifetime. And as the realization dawned, a wave of anger and sadness washed over me. I wasn't just heartbroken, I was furious. I wanted to confront him, to demand answers. But I knew I needed more. This was too big, too serious to be dealt with in a single conversation. We needed to gather evidence, to understand exactly what had happened, and to figure out how we could make him pay for what he had done. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I had to do something about this. I couldn't just let it go. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I wasn't alone in this. This wasn't just my pain, it was the pain of all the women sitting around me, all of us betrayed by the man we had trusted. That we weren't going to let this man get away with it. We were going to expose him for who he really was. And we would make sure that justice was served, no matter what it took. The room was still eerily quiet as we all sat there, holding our breath, as though we were waiting for someone to speak, to make sense of what had just happened. I looked at each of the women around me, and for the first time, I truly saw the weight of what we were all carrying. Sarah was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the envelope to her chest as though it might somehow protect her from the painful truth we had all just uncovered. Lisa, usually the life of the party, looked like a ghost. Her face was frozen, her eyes staring at nothing in particular. Laura, who had always been the most level-headed of us, was the first to speak, her voice a low murmur. "We need to think carefully about what we do next," she said, her words heavy with the gravity of the situation. "This isn't just a betrayal, this is a violation. We need to figure out what we're going to do with this information." The room fell into silence once again, each of us lost in our thoughts. I was numb, my brain racing as I tried to comprehend everything. How had we missed it? How had we been so blind? Dr. Hayes had been our trusted doctor, the man we had relied on for years to help us start families. And yet here we were, with the most damning proof of his deception. "We can't just let this go," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. It was shaking with emotion, but there was also a cold edge to it, a sudden sense of clarity. We can't just sweep this under the rug and pretend it didn't happen. Lisa looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of confusion and frustration. "What are you saying? What do we even do? Do we confront him? Do we tell our husbands? What if we ruin everything? What if we destroy our families?" I knew she was scared. We all were. The consequences of this discovery were staggering. The betrayal was not just against us, it was against our families, our marriages, and the very foundation of everything we had built. But as much as I understood her fear, I couldn't shake the anger that burned in my chest. I had trusted Dr. Hayes more than anyone. He had been a figure of authority, someone we believed would always do what was right. Now, we were left in the wake of his lies, and I couldn't stand it. "We need to expose him," I said firmly, my voice growing steadier with each passing word. "This isn't just something we can bury and move on from. He used his position of trust to manipulate us, to control our lives. We have to make sure he never hurts anyone else like this again." There was a long pause as my friends considered my words. I could see the fear in their eyes. This wasn't a small decision. If we chose to confront Dr. Hayes, we risked losing everything. Our marriages, our families, the lives we had built. But if we didn't take action, we would live with the constant reminder of how our trust had been shattered. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. What if we're wrong? What if this is some kind of mistake? We're not wrong, I said, my voice unwavering. The DNA tests don't lie. This is real. And Dr. Hayes needs to be held accountable for what he's done. After a long, tense silence, Laura finally spoke up, her tone more resolute than it had been before. We need to gather evidence, all of it. We can't just confront him without having proof. If we're going to make him pay for this, we need to be sure we have everything we need to expose him. Lisa nodded slowly, the wheels turning in her head. You're right. We can't just go in there without a plan. We have to be smart about this. And so, the plan began to take shape. It wasn't going to be easy, and we knew it wouldn't be quick. We would need to gather more evidence, more than just the DNA results. We needed to understand exactly how Dr. Hayes had manipulated us, how he had orchestrated this betrayal. We needed to know what his motivations had been, and how deep this web of lies stretched. Over the next few days, we worked together, pooling our resources and our knowledge. Sarah, who had always been tech-savvy, took the lead on researching Dr. Hayes. We needed to know everything about him, his professional history, his personal life, anything that could shed light on his actions. Lisa reached out to other women who had been his patients, trying to see if anyone else had experienced anything similar. Meanwhile, Laura and I started gathering our own testimonies, preparing to confront Dr. Hayes face-to-face when the time came, but as we delved deeper into the investigation, we began to uncover things that made our blood run cold. Dr. Hayes had been involved in a number of questionable activities throughout his career. He had manipulated not just our lives, but the lives of countless others. He had used his position of power to manipulate women, offering them false hope and taking advantage of their vulnerability. Some of the women he had helped conceive children for had no idea that their children might not even be biologically related to their husbands. Others had come to him in good faith, hoping to have a family, only to have their trust shattered. That we were beginning to piece together the full scope of his betrayal, and with each new discovery, our resolve hardened. We couldn't let him get away with this. He had to pay for what he had done. But even as we worked tirelessly to expose Dr. Hayes, a sense of unease began to grow inside me. The more I learned, the more I realized that confronting him might not be enough. Dr. Hayes wasn't just some small-time conman. He was a respected doctor with a lot of influence, and we were just four ordinary women trying to take him down. What if we were making a huge mistake? What if this would destroy our lives, too? The fear gnawed at me, but it didn't stop me. The truth was out there, and we couldn't hide from it. We couldn't let this man ruin any more lives. It was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. And we would make sure he did. The days after we decided to confront Dr. Hayes felt like an eternity. Each of us was consumed by the weight of what we were about to do. We had gathered all the evidence we could, documents, testimonies, and recordings, and it was becoming increasingly clear that this was not just a case of one man's betrayal. Dr. Hayes had been manipulating his position for years, and the impact of his actions stretched far beyond the four of us. But even with all the evidence, the fear of what would happen next loomed over us like a dark cloud that I couldn't sleep at night. My mind kept racing, replaying the images of the DNA results, the shock on our faces as we all came to the horrifying realization that our children had been fathered by the same man. I thought about my husband, Michael, and the life we had built together. I had always trusted him implicitly, never once doubting our relationship. But now, with the revelation that our son wasn't biologically his, I felt a deep sense of guilt and betrayal. Was our marriage a lie? Was everything we had shared for the last decade just a carefully constructed illusion? I couldn't shake the image of Michael's face when he found out. How could I tell him that our son wasn't his? How would I face him, knowing that my betrayal was just as deep as Dr. Hayes's? I wasn't the only one struggling with these questions. Sarah, always so strong and confident, had become distant. She'd stopped answering our texts and phone calls, retreating into herself. I knew she was having a hard time processing what had happened, but I also knew she was wrestling with a bigger issue, her husband, James. They had always had a strong relationship, or so she thought. But now that everything had come to light, Sarah was questioning whether James was the father of their child. She couldn't bear the thought of confronting him with the truth. Laura, too, had become increasingly withdrawn. She'd always been the practical one, the one who could hold everything together when the rest of us fell apart. But now, she seemed lost in her own thoughts, her usually organized mind clouded by the weight of the situation. I could tell she was struggling to keep it together. She had always prided herself on being in control, but now it felt as though everything was slipping through her fingers. Lisa was the only one who seemed to be holding it together. At least, on the surface. She continued to be the glue that held the group together, organizing our meetings and making sure we stayed on track with our plan. But even she couldn't hide the anger that had begun to build inside her. The anger at Dr. Hayes, at the men who had been complicit in this betrayal, and at the world that had allowed this to happen. We had all been so blind, so trusting. And now, we were paying the price. Our families were unraveling, our marriages were in jeopardy, and the one man we had trusted had shattered everything. But despite the emotional chaos, we couldn't stop now. We had come too far. We had the evidence, and we had a plan. We would expose Dr. Hayes for who he truly was. But we knew that doing so would come at a cost. The plan was simple, but the execution would be anything but. We would confront Dr. Hayes at his clinic, armed with the DNA results, the testimonies from other women who had been victimized by him, and every other piece of evidence we had gathered. We would make sure that he knew we weren't going to back down. We weren't just going to let him walk away from this. We would hold him accountable, no matter what it took. But as the day of the confrontation approached, the tension in the air grew thick. The fear, the anxiety, the anger, it all felt suffocating. None of us were sure what would happen once we walked into that clinic. Would Dr. Hayes try to deny everything? Would he threaten us? Would he try to discredit us? The unknown was terrifying, but what terrified me even more was the thought of going back to our husbands, to our families, with nothing but the truth. What would we tell them? How would we explain this? Would they believe us, or would they blame us for what had happened? I couldn't keep pretending that everything would be okay. The reality of the situation was setting in. If we went through with this, there would be no turning back. Our lives would never be the same. Dr. Hayes had shattered the foundation of everything we had built, and now we had to face the consequences of our actions. The night before our confrontation, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned in bed, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I thought about my son, about Michael, and about the future. I thought about the lies we had all been living, and the truth that was about to come crashing down. I couldn't help but wonder if it was worth it. Was it worth destroying our families to get justice for what had been done to us? But then I thought about what Dr. Hayes had taken from us. He had violated our trust in the most intimate way possible. He had stolen from us the one thing that should have been sacred, our ability to trust those who were supposed to protect us. We had to do this, not just for ourselves, but for our children, for every other woman who had been taken advantage of in the same way. As dawn broke, I felt a strange sense of resolve settle over me. I was scared, yes, but I was also determined. We were going to do this. We were going to take down the man who had destroyed our lives. And when we did, we would finally have the justice we so desperately deserved. The morning of our confrontation with Dr. Hayes was a blur. It felt like the calm before a storm, the quiet before the chaos would begin. We met at Laura's house early that day, each of us arriving with a sense of unease and anticipation that weighed heavily on our shoulders. It was clear that none of us knew exactly how this would play out. What would Dr. Hayes do when we confronted him with the truth? How would he react? Would he admit to what he had done, or would he try to deny it, like so many criminals do when caught? The drive to Dr. Hayes's clinic was painfully slow. The silence in the car was deafening, each of us lost in our thoughts, imagining different scenarios. Would he be cooperative, or would he turn the tables on us, trying to twist the situation to his advantage? Every second felt like an eternity as we drove closer to the place that had been the source of our pain for so long. When we arrived at the clinic, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The building looked the same as always, sleek, professional, and utterly unassuming. It was hard to believe that this was the place where so much deception had taken root. As we parked, my hands were shaking. I could hear my breath in my ears, steady but quick, and I felt the weight of what we were about to do pressing down on me like a physical force that we gathered in front of the building, standing in a tight circle. For a moment, none of us spoke. We simply stood there, staring at the entrance to the clinic, as if we were trying to will ourselves into being brave. The plan was simple. We would walk in, confront Dr. Hayes with the evidence, and demand that he explain himself. We had the DNA results, the testimonies, everything we needed to expose him. But even with all the evidence, the fear of what would happen next was almost overwhelming. "Are we ready?" Laura asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the uncertainty beneath it. There was a collective sigh as we all nodded. We didn't have a choice anymore. We had come this far, and there was no turning back. We walked through the door, the sound of it swinging open echoing in the otherwise quiet clinic. The receptionist greeted us with a smile, but it quickly faded when she saw the look on our faces. "We didn't have time for pleasantries, we need to speak with Dr. Hayes," I said, my voice firm but steady. "It's urgent." The receptionist hesitated for a moment, then nodded and picked up the phone. "I'll let him know you're here," she said quietly. Moments later, Dr. Hayes appeared in the doorway, his usual calm demeanor in place. He greeted us with a friendly smile, as though nothing was amiss, as though we were just another set of patients waiting for his attention. But the second his eyes met ours, I could see the flicker of recognition in them, the awareness that something was very wrong. He paused, his smile faltering ever so slightly. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice polite but guarded. Without wasting a second, Laura stepped forward and placed the envelope with the DNA results in front of him. "You know exactly what this is about," she said, her voice unwavering. "You've been lying to us for years. You've been manipulating us, using your position to betray our trust. And we're not going to let you get away with it." For a moment, Dr. Hayes didn't speak. His eyes flickered between each of us, assessing the situation. He took the envelope, his fingers shaking ever so slightly as he opened it. His face remained impassive as he looked at the results, but I could tell that the gravity of the situation was beginning to sink in. "What is this?" he asked, his voice now tinged with the slightest trace of panic. "It's the truth," Lisa said, her voice cold and steady. "The truth you've been hiding from us for years. All of our children, our sons, were fathered by you. You've been using your position as a doctor to manipulate us, to violate our trust, and we won't stand for it any longer." The room was silent for a long moment. Dr. Hayes stood frozen, his eyes darting between us, trying to process what was happening. The air was thick with tension. I could see the gears turning in his mind as he tried to figure out how to spin this, how to salvage his reputation. But there was no way out. The truth was out in the open now, and nothing he could say would change that. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but still trying to maintain some semblance of control. "You're making a huge mistake," he said, his words barely above a whisper. "You don't understand the full picture. You have no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, We understand perfectly, I said, my voice rising with the intensity of the moment. You've been lying to us, betraying us, and using your medical license to cover up your actions. But this stops now. We have the evidence, and we're not leaving here until you're held accountable for everything you've done. For the first time, Dr. Hayes seemed to lose his composure. His facade cracked, and I could see the panic creeping into his expression. He took a step back, his hand gripping the edge of the desk as though he were trying to steady himself. His lips trembled, and I knew that deep down, he realized that there was no escape from the truth. I can explain, he began, but his voice was weak, no longer confident. This wasn't. I never meant for it to happen like this. You have to understand, I never wanted to hurt anyone. Save it, Sarah snapped, stepping forward. You don't get to explain your way out of this. You've hurt us, you've hurt our families, and you've hurt your patients. You don't deserve an explanation. You deserve to be exposed for what you are. Dr. Hayes took another step back, his face pale, his mind clearly scrambling for a way to salvage his career and his freedom. But it was too late. The damage was done, and the truth had already shattered his carefully constructed world. The confrontation lasted for only a few more minutes, but it felt like hours. There were no more words from Dr. Hayes, only a series of weak protests and denials. But none of it mattered anymore. We had exposed him for who he truly was, and he knew it. As we left the clinic, there was a sense of quiet triumph among us. The fear and anxiety that had been building up inside us for weeks began to fade, replaced by a strange sense of relief. We had done it. We had confronted the man who had stolen our peace of mind, our trust, and our sense of security. And now, we could begin to rebuild. But even as we walked away from the clinic, I knew this was just the beginning. We had taken the first step in exposing Dr. Hayes, but the fight wasn't over yet. There were still more battles to be fought, more people to confront, and more consequences to face. But for now, we had done what we set out to do. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like we might just be able to heal. The days following our confrontation with Dr. Hayes were a whirlwind of emotions. As much as we felt a sense of relief after exposing the truth, the reality of the consequences began to set in. Dr. Hayes had been a pillar in our community, a well-respected doctor, trusted by so many. Now, with his life and career in ruins, we couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would he seek revenge? Would he try to destroy us? We didn't know, but we could feel the tension hanging in the air, threatening to consume us. We all went our separate ways after leaving the clinic. There was an unspoken understanding that we needed time to process what had happened, to think about the future and what steps we needed to take. But even in our solitude, none of us could escape the weight of what we had done. It was impossible to ignore the fact that we had just destroyed a man's life. No matter how much he deserved it, no matter how justified we were in exposing his actions, the aftermath felt heavy. We had taken a powerful man down, and now we had to deal with the repercussions. For me, the biggest fear was how this would affect my family. I had always prided myself on being a good wife and mother, but now I wondered if I could ever look at my husband, Michael, the same way. How could I tell him that our son, the child we had raised together, wasn't biologically his? How could I explain to him that Dr. Hayes had been the one to father our child? The guilt was suffocating. I had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible, and there was no turning back from that. When I finally told Michael the truth, it was the hardest conversation I had ever had. He listened in silence, his face expressionless, as I explained what had happened, the DNA results, the confrontation, everything. There was no hiding the pain in his eyes when I told him that our son wasn't his biological child. I could see the hurt in his gaze, the sense of betrayal that mirrored my own. "You lied to me," he said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. "All this time, you've been lying to me. How could you let this happen?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't know how to explain the twisted web of lies and manipulation that had led us here. All I could do was apologize, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. How could it be? I had broken the most sacred trust we had. Sarah, too, was facing the fallout in her marriage. She had been so certain that James was the father of their child, so confident in their relationship. But now, everything was called into question. She had always thought she knew who James was, but after the DNA results, she wasn't so sure. She wasn't ready to confront him, not yet. She spent days pacing around her house, avoiding him, unsure of how to bring up the truth. Every time they spoke, she felt the walls closing in on her. How could she ask him to believe her now? Would he even want to stay with her after everything that had happened? Laura's marriage was no better. Her husband, Brian, had been devastated by the revelation that their daughter wasn't his biological child. But unlike Sarah, who was still hesitant to confront her husband, Laura dove headfirst into the uncomfortable truth. She wanted to confront Brian, to tell him everything, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. She was terrified that he would leave her, that he would look at their daughter and wonder if she was really his. But there was no escaping the reality of their situation. Lisa, however, seemed to be taking everything in stride. She had always been the most level-headed of the group, the one who kept us grounded when things got chaotic. But even she couldn't ignore the toll the situation was taking on her. She was putting on a brave face, handling everything with calm determination, but I could see the cracks beginning to show. She hadn't spoken to her husband, Kevin, yet. She wasn't sure how to bring up the fact that their son wasn't his, or whether she should at all. There were too many unknowns, too many fears to face. Despite the overwhelming emotions we were all dealing with, there was one thing that kept us united: our desire for justice. We had exposed Dr. Hayes for what he was, and now we had to make sure that he paid for his crimes. The impact of his betrayal had not only ruined our lives but also the lives of so many others. The women he had manipulated, the families he had destroyed, they all deserved justice. We couldn't let him get away with it. The decision was made. We would take legal action. We would ensure that Dr. Hayes would be held accountable, and we would do everything in our power to make sure that he never had the chance to hurt anyone again. The first step was to contact a lawyer. We needed someone who could help us navigate the complicated legal system and make sure we had a case against him. We couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. We had to be meticulous. We gathered all the evidence we had collected, DNA results, testimonies, medical records, and presented it to the lawyer. After reviewing everything, the lawyer told us that we had a strong case. But it wasn't going to be easy. Dr. Hayes was powerful, and he had the resources to fight back. We needed to be prepared for a long and difficult battle. Meanwhile, Dr. Hayes was doing everything he could to save himself. He had lawyers of his own, and they were already working on damage control. He denied everything, claimed that the DNA results were tampered with, and even tried to discredit the women who had come forward. He was trying to paint us as liars, trying to turn the situation around so that he could avoid responsibility. But no matter how many lies he told, we knew the truth. And we were determined to make sure the world knew it too. The legal battle dragged on for months, each day feeling like an eternity. The pressure was building on all of us. We were fighting not just for justice, but for our own peace of mind. We needed to know that we had done everything we could to hold Dr. Hayes accountable. But as the months went by, we couldn't help but wonder if we had made the right decision. Had we ruined our own lives by exposing the truth? Had we destroyed our families beyond repair? But deep down, I knew we had made the right choice. We couldn't let Dr. Hayes win. He had hurt us in ways we couldn't even begin to comprehend. And we weren't going to let him get away with it. The legal battle stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and each day was a relentless reminder of the chaos we had unleashed. But as the trial date loomed closer, something within me began to shift. I had spent so much time focusing on the anger, the betrayal, and the need for revenge. But now, in the quiet moments, when I allowed myself to reflect, I started to realize that there was something deeper at play. I wasn't just fighting for justice, I was fighting for the healing of our families, for our ability to move forward, to rebuild, and to reclaim our sense of peace. Dr. Hayes had proven to be a master manipulator. He was a charismatic man with an almost magnetic presence, and his defense team had spared no expense in trying to discredit our claims. The court was a battleground, and every session felt like we were walking through a storm of lies, half-truths, and manipulations. Dr. Hayes' legal team relentlessly poked holes in our testimonies, twisting our words, trying to paint us as unstable and unreliable. They knew that if they could just plant enough doubt in the minds of the jurors, they could win the case. But no matter how hard they tried, we held fast to the truth that I could see how hard it was on all of us. The women who had come forward with their stories were all deeply affected. Sarah had spent sleepless nights replaying the events in her mind, trying to piece together the moments that led her to Dr. Hayes. Laura was struggling to find a way to repair the relationship with her husband, Brian, but every time she looked at him, she saw the pain in his eyes. Lisa, ever the stoic one, had begun to crack under the pressure. She was beginning to question everything, wondering if there was any way forward from here. It felt like we were on the edge of a precipice, and one wrong move could send us tumbling into the abyss, but despite it all, we couldn't back down. This fight wasn't just about us, it was about our children, our families, and all the people Dr. Hayes had hurt. We couldn't let him continue to destroy lives, to manipulate people without consequences. We had come too far to turn back now. As the trial wore on, a breakthrough came unexpectedly. One of Dr. Hayes' former colleagues, a woman named Dr. Amelia Turner, reached out to us. She had been a close associate of Dr. Hayes for many years, but over time, she had grown disillusioned with his behavior. She had witnessed the way he manipulated patients, how he used his position of power to take advantage of vulnerable women. She had been silent for years, too afraid to speak out, but the mounting evidence in our case pushed her to come forward. Dr. Turner's testimony was nothing short of explosive. She provided key evidence that not only corroborated our stories but painted a damning picture of Dr. Hayes' behavior. She spoke of the countless women who had come to him for medical advice, only to find themselves coerced into sexual relationships under the guise of treatment. She revealed that Dr. Hayes had been systematically using his position as a trusted doctor to manipulate his patients, preying on their vulnerabilities. Her testimony was the turning point in our case. With Dr. Turner's account, the tide began to turn in our favor. The defense had no choice but to retreat, their arguments unraveling under the weight of the truth. The prosecution, armed with this new evidence, built an even stronger case against Dr. Hayes. It wasn't long before the jury deliberated and returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and sorrow. We had won, but the victory felt hollow. The damage had already been done. Dr. Hayes' life would never be the same, and neither would ours. We had exposed his darkest secrets, but in doing so, we had lost something along the way. We had lost the innocence we once had, the belief that the people we trusted the most were always worthy of that trust. We had lost a part of ourselves in the process. As Dr. Hayes was led away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but wonder what would become of us now. What did life look like after this? Could we ever truly move forward, or were we forever bound to the past we had tried so hard to escape? But as time went on, something unexpected happened. Slowly, we began to rebuild. The pain was still there, lingering in the background, but we started to find a sense of healing. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but we were learning to move forward, one day at a time. Sarah and James found a way to navigate their new reality. They decided to seek therapy together, to work through the immense strain this revelation had placed on their relationship. It wasn't an easy journey, but they both agreed that their marriage was worth fighting for. With time, they learned to trust each other again, and while things would never be the same, they found a new way to love. Laura and Brian took their own steps toward healing. Brian had been deeply hurt, but he wasn't willing to give up on his family. They both agreed that they needed to start fresh, to find new ways of connecting with each other. It wasn't perfect, but they were willing to put in the effort. Their daughter, though not Brian's biological child, was still his daughter in every sense of the word. Together, they found a way to move forward, to create a future where love and trust could once again thrive. Lisa, who had been so strong throughout it all, finally allowed herself to let down her guard. She and Kevin decided to take a break from their busy lives, spending time away from the chaos to reconnect and rediscover their bond. It was a slow process, but eventually, they came back stronger than ever. Their son, like all our children, would always be a reminder of the pain they had endured. But together, they learned to navigate life as a family, grounded in the love and trust they had fought so hard to reclaim. As for me, I had to face the fact that my life, my marriage, and my family would never be the same. But in a strange way, I had come to accept it. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could change how I moved forward. Michael and I, after months of silence and heartache, finally found a way to reconnect. It wasn't easy, and there were still many unresolved issues, but we both agreed that our family was worth saving. It would take time, but we were willing to try. In the end, justice was served. Dr. Hayes was sentenced to prison, and his life was forever changed. But for us, the real victory was in the healing that followed. The scars would remain, but they no longer controlled us. We had been through the fire, and while we were forever changed, we were also stronger for it. We had learned the hard way that trust is fragile, that betrayal can shatter everything you thought you knew. But we had also learned that, even in the darkest of times, there is hope. There is always a way to rebuild, to reclaim what was lost, and to find a new path forward.